today. Oh my God, what is that? Oh my God, what is that?
It will grow back. Okay, give it like 10 to 15 business days. So today's video is going to be the mid-year book freakout tag, and unlike the rest of y'all bitches, I'm actually going to be doing it at the midpoint of the year instead of 3 weeks early. And I'm actually going to be using this as an opportunity to wrap up all of the books that I've read for the year so far. I read literally nothing for the first 4 months of the year, and I only started back reading like halfway through May, and since then I've read 10 books. So we're going to talk about the 10 books in this video. The first question is the best book that you've read for the year, and that is definitely going to have to be The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. I read all of John Green's books. This is his 6th book, I believe, and it's his first book of nonfiction, and it is essentially a collection of essays of reviews of random things that exist in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, if you didn't know, is the proposed term for the current geological age. I think it's not the actual term for the current geological age, but a lot of scientists and, I don't know, paleontologists or whoever, are of the opinion that we should call the time period, like I guess the last couple of thousand years or so that humans have had a huge impact on the earth, the Anthropocene, because we have turned it into a human-centered world. So John Green is basically reviewing the Anthropocene. So he's taking up like random things, from animals to places to events to all sorts of different things that have to do with the human world, or things that humans have had an impact on, or things that have shaped us in some way, shape, or form. He's taking those things and reviewing them and then giving them a star rating at the end. And the essays are not necessarily centered on the thing itself, but the bigger picture, like how they impact humanity, what they say about us, the history of these things and our relationships with them. It's a really interesting and thought-provoking read, and I really enjoyed it. I also got a signed edition, and John is so extra, he has like a review of autographs next to his autograph, which, you know, is very John Green of him. I really love this. I highly recommend that you read it. If you want to know more of my thoughts, go over on my Bookstagram. I did a review of it. The next question is the least favorite book that you've read for the year. Now, this book is not bad by any means, but it is my least favorite of the 10 that I've read so far, and that is The Sorcerer's Conquest by Mikhail Khan, which is the first book in the Inixa series. This is an independently published Trinidadian writer, and that's why I picked this book up in the first place. And I thought it was okay. It's just that it was too short, and we didn't really get enough time with the characters and with the story and whatnot. It's set in like this medieval fantasy world where it's like this evil king who's also like a wizard or a warlock or a sorcerer or something, and he is like a tyrant, and he has this granddaughter who's his apprentice, and then we have this guy who works for him but is getting tired of his regime, so decides to start a rebellion against him, and that's kind of what the book centers on. It's okay, it's an okay book. I just felt like it was nothing new, it was nothing special, and it's something that I would definitely recommend to younger readers, but not something that I think any of you on this channel would be particularly interested in. Next up is the most surprising book that you read for the year, and for this one I'm going to have to go with Almost American Girl by Robin Ha. This is a graphic memoir, and usually with graphic novels and graphic works in general, I'm not a huge fan of them. I don't know why, they just don't really do it for me most of the time, but this book was really good, which is why it was surprising to me. So this is the true story of Robin Ha. When she was a teenager, her mother decided to take her on a trip to America, claiming that they're going to visit a family friend in Alabama. But when she gets there, she realizes that her mother is actually engaged to that family friend, and they are actually going to be permanently relocating to the United States. So her whole life in South Korea has been uprooted to now live in a country where she looks different, talks different, acts different, where she doesn't even speak the language properly. And it was a really difficult read, just to see like a lot of the struggles that she went through, not just with the racism and discrimination that she experienced in her school environment and elsewhere, but also living at home. Her new step family wasn't too fond of her and didn't really treat her and her mother well. The book is essentially about coping and hope. She had hope throughout the novel because she knows she didn't have much of a choice. She needed to push on through the situation that she was in, and her coping mechanism was art. Obviously, I mean, you know, she's a graphic memoirist now, so she was always into like drawing and comics and that kind of stuff, and that was a huge element of the story, and that was kind of like her escape from reality, reading comics as well as drawing and making her own comics. So I liked that this book explored all of those different things and what it means to be Korea and what it means to be American, and the idea of home and what home is and what home constitutes. it was a really, really good book, and I highly recommend it if you're into graphic stuff. The most disappointing read of the year, I actually have two for this. So the first is Out on Main Street by Shani Mutu. You might recall that last year I read 3 of her novels and absolutely loved them, so I had really high expectations for this, but I probably should have adjusted my expectations because this is a short story collection, and short story collections are usually very hit or miss for me. The ones that I tend to like more are the ones that feel very deliberate, where the stories are cohesive and you could tell that the author put together, you know, this short story collection. Like, they wrote these short stories in mind of the fact that they're making a short story collection, as opposed to the type of short story collections where it just feels like a bunch of random stories that the author might have written compiled into one, which is more along the lines of what I think this is. The stories just didn't really feel very cohesive, and that's one thing. The other thing was that none of them were particularly impactful or memorable for me. The only thing I really enjoyed about this book was the writing. Shani Mutu's writing style is just amazing. I would read anything she writes, you know, but I still think that a lot of the stories in here are important, and they do explore really interesting and profound ideas about, you know, identity and sexuality at the intersection of being Indo-Caribbean, and my light just came off.
This is how I press it. Ah! What the fuck?
We just fixed that. The book that really disappointed me, though, was Zara Hussein is Here by Sabina Khan. This is her second contemporary novel. I loved her first contemporary book, which is called The Love and Lives of Roxana Ali. This one didn't really live up to that. It was okay. It's following this girl named Zara who's experiencing a lot of bullying at school, particularly at the hands of this one white boy named Tyler, and the bullying escalates so much to the point where it actually, for reasons that you'll understand when you read the book, if you decide to read it, puts her family's immigration status at risk. So the book is essentially meant to be an exploration of like discrimination and the way that Muslim Americans are treated, as well as immigrant Americans, and the problems that exist within the immigration system in the United States. It was fine, but my main problem with this book, as is my main problem with a lot of YA novels that try to deal with social justice themes, is how on the nose they are. They come across as very preachy and performative in ways that I don't really like. It kind of felt like we were being spoon-fed, like, you know, ideas about justice and whatnot. I like when, you know, stories about injustice explore that injustice in ways that are a lot more organic and subtle. Not necessarily subtle, but organic, where it feels real and where it doesn't feel like there's an author behind it trying to push an agenda or a message, if that makes sense. I'm not like against stories having agendas, because every story, no matter what, has an agenda. I just love when the agenda is incorporated in a more creative way. Says the person who can't think of a more creative word than creative. Yeah, but it was fine. It wasn't a terrible book, and it is the book that got me back into reading. Like, this is the first book that I read for the year. So, I mean, I'm grateful for that, I guess. The next two questions are a new favorite author and the best sequel, and I can answer both of these questions with one response, and that is the Binti series by Nnedi Okorafor, who is an author I definitely want to read more of. I only read the first 2 books in the Binti series. The first book is called Binti, and the second one is called Binti Home. I haven't read the third book in the trilogy as yet, but Binti Home is the only sequel that I read for the year, so, you know, will count for this prompt. And Nnedi Okorafor is an author that I definitely want to read more of. I actually read Zahra the Windseeker a couple of years ago. I don't think I finished it, but I read a good bit of it, and for some reason the story wasn't working for me at the time that I read it, so I kind of internalized that Nnedi Okorafor is an author who I just would not care to read anymore, which couldn't be further from the truth, because I picked up these 2 books and I really, really enjoyed them, and I'm very curious to delve into some more of her work. This particular trilogy, though, is about this girl named Binti, who is from this tribe called the Himba, and they are very isolated. They don't believe in interacting with the outside world, far more the outside universe. But Binti decides to break that rule, and she runs away one night on a spaceship and heads to a university that she was accepted into on the other side of the Milky Way galaxy. The rain is about to fall and be obnoxiously loud, so I hope you can tolerate that noise in the background that I can't do anything about.
I'm so fucking angry!
The next prompt is a book that made you cry, and for this one I'm going to go with We Have Always Been Here, a queer Muslim memoir by Samra Habib. So this is essentially Samra Habib's life story, being a queer Muslim who grew up in Pakistan and eventually moved to Canada. And a lot of the book didn't really talk much about queerness or Islam until closer to the last few chapters. And that's where she really kind of delved into her queer Muslim identity. And what kind of made me teary-eyed closer to the end was when she was talking about how she visited a queer Muslim mosque in Toronto, where I believe a trans woman called the Adhan, or the call to prayer. And that just made me tear up because I felt so happy to know that there is a space that is specifically for queer Muslims who are not just people who call themselves queer Muslims, but are queer and do practice Islam and want to find that space and want to exist within that limbo of being queer and Muslim. And I don't know, that just made me so emotional, and I felt so happy for her in that moment that she found that space for herself. Next up is a book that made you happy, and for this one I'm going to go with Butterfly in the Wind by Lakshmi Prasad. This is a modern classic in its own right. It's set in Trinidad and it takes place during like the 1940s and 50s. We're following this girl named Kamla as she's growing up in Paget, and it is anecdotes about her life as she grows up, so it's very episodic in nature. There's no overarching narrative or plot. It's very similar to like Miguel Street or House on Mango Street in that sense, where every little chapter, every part of the book represents like a new situation or idea that the character is navigating. And I really enjoyed that. I loved seeing her grow up. I loved seeing her life, and what I liked about it the most was that her life was not tragic or traumatic in any way. Usually books of this nature, West Indian novels of this nature, tend to have a lot of like violence and sexism and racism and stuff, and those things are valid things to write about, but sometimes it could become a little bit overwhelming when every single Caribbean novel that you pick up, especially along the lines of like literary fiction, tends to be very traumatic and deals with all of these really difficult topics. But this book was really chill, she does have sexist older relatives, but their sexism is not what defines them, and it makes sense for the time, and they're also not completely terrible people. They're very complex characters, and everybody's just chill and loving and cool and trying to get by and trying to live honest lives, and it felt like such a refreshing read, and that's why it made me happy. In addition to that, the writing in here is phenomenal. The storytelling is great, and it really left a lasting impact on me. And finally, we have a book to movie adaptation, and I didn't really watch any book to movie adaptations this year, but I did read a book and saw aspects of that story adapted into a show. So I love Once Upon a Time. Once Upon a Time is my favorite show of all time, regardless of how questionable the last 2 seasons, especially the last season, was. But I still love that show, and it means a lot to me. And I watched the first 5 seasons years ago, but I never finished up the last 2 seasons. So this time around I rewatched it, and I also watched the last 2 seasons for the first time. And the 6th season, I was watching it for the first time, featured Jekyll and Hyde, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So I decided that I wanted to read the book, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, before I go ahead and watch season 6. So I read it to see how it was adapted in the story. And I really enjoyed the book itself. It was so surprising because, you're so used to seeing a lot of these like older classic books referenced that the cultural references almost become separated from the actual original text itself. They take on a life of their own, if that makes sense. The perfect example of that is like Frankenstein, but Jekyll and Hyde I think is a close second to that. So it was interesting to actually go back to the source text and see the story for what it originally was, and it was cool. I liked it. It was interesting. It had some really interesting underlying themes about, good versus evil and the duality of man and all that kind of stuff. My biggest takeaway from it though is that Henry Jekyll had the fucking time. This man was an heir to this great fortune, so he had no job, he also had no hobbies, nothing to do, right, but sit down and philosophize about his life and his regrets, to the point where it compelled him to make a potion that essentially led to his own demise. And I just kept thinking, if he had something to do, if he had a hobby, if he had a job, if he had a boyfriend to blow his back out in an alley, like he would not be, sitting down and thinking about all these things and letting it fester in his mind to the point where he literally drinks a potion. What's a potion? He drinks a potion that ruined his life. So I don't know, I just felt like, Jekyll needed to take up knitting or something. But yeah, in terms of Once Upon a Time, I really liked how they adapted the story. It didn't really last as long as I thought it would, because season 6 was just too much. They tried to do too much stories in one season, and so they ended off the Jekyll and Hyde thing just like about 5 episodes in. But it was interesting to see how it was done and how the characters were portrayed in the story. I wouldn't say it was a faithful adaptation. I mean, Once Upon a Time takes a lot of creative liberties. If you've watched that show, you'd know Jekyll and Hyde in the Once Upon a Time are nothing like the ones in the book, especially Hyde, who's supposed to be like this ugly, hideous, disgusting, person, and then they casted this guy to play Hyde in Once Upon a Time, and I was like, well, that's not what I would call a faithful adaptation, although I ain't complaining.
Like, what do they
get
say?
called white man's whore.
But what they were faithful to was the underlying theme of Robert Louis Stevenson's story about, again, the duality of man and good versus evil, and how we are all complex and we're not just good or just evil, but we are morally ambiguous beings who are just trying to navigate the world, and whether we're good or evil or not depends on how we choose to react to things and how the world affects us in general. And it was really interesting to see how they explored that in the show, and I liked how they kind of kept true to at least the thematic undertones of the book. So that concludes the wrap-up portion of this video. The next couple of questions have to do with books I haven't read as yet. So the first one is a new release you haven't read yet but that you really want to, and I have 2 new YA releases that I have right here that I want to get around to soon. The first is An Emotion of Great Delight by Takada. This is her second contemporary young adult novel. I loved A Very Large Expanse of Sea, so I'm really excited to get into this one. So it takes place in 2003, around the time that the US invaded Iraq, and the main character of this book is from America, but her parents are from Iran. So it's set in the wake of 9/11 and all of these different things that were happening around the world. So Shadi is experiencing a lot of discrimination in her life, and I also believe that the book follows a romance as well. And Mafi did say, and my camera decided to shut off on me, so I had to fix that. But as I was saying, Mafi actually said herself that this is the best romance that she thinks she's ever written, and hopefully that's true. So I'm really excited to read this book and see what it's all about. The next new release that came out this year that I'm very excited to read is called Where the Rhythm Takes You by Sarah Das. This is actually sent to me by the author. She's from Trinidad and Tobago. The book itself is set in Tobago, and it follows this girl who I believe lives in or around a resort, and this boy who she knew when she was growing up returns to Tobago and is now staying at the resort. So it's about how she's dealing with that, I think. I'm really excited for this because I've never really read a book set in Tobago before. I've read, obviously, tons of books set in Trinidad, but nothing set in Tobago, which is shameful. So, very excited to read this, and thank you so much to Sarah Das for sending this book to me. She even signed it, which was so sweet, so I'm very excited. I do have another new release, I was going to say the Henna Wars, Honey and Issues Guide to Fake Dating by Adiba Jagardar, who's the author of the Henna Wars. So, looking forward to this as well. I don't know what it's about other than somebody named Hani and somebody named Ushu, and they are fake dating. Did I say Ushu? The next question is the most anticipated release for the second half of the year, and I have 3 that I'm very excited for. The first one I actually have an arc of right here, and that is Journey to the Heart of the Abyss, which is the sequel to Light at the Bottom of the World. If you all know, I really, really love this book. Amazing sci-fi novel set in a futuristic underwater London. And this is the second book and the conclusion to the duology. So I'm really, really excited for this. I love this underwater science fiction world, so I'm interested to dive deeper into it. Pun intended. And it was actually sent to me by the author. This is an arc, obviously, because the book doesn't come out until October, and she signed it. Look at me just showing off all my signed books like some bougie book bitch. Ooh! The books almost fell. I'll just put them back on the shelves. I'm also really anticipating Aristotle and Dante Dive into the Waters of the World, which is the sequel to, I really need to stop doing this, it's the sequel to Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe, which is one of my all-time favorite young adult contemporary novels. I love this book, but we don't really get to see much of Aristotle and Dante together as a couple. Like throughout the book, it was just them like not knowing whether they wanted to be together or not, or really just Ari not knowing until the absolute end. So we never really got to see much of their dynamic together and their relationship like post getting together. So I'm really excited to read this book to see how that's done, and I really hope that they stay together and they remain together and no breakups or deaths happen because I feel like that is something that Benjamin Alirasans would do. So hopefully he doesn't break my heart, and hopefully he keeps my OTB happy and together. Like, I'm sure they'll have some trials and tribulations that will be solved by the end. And my light came off again. Today is just not my day. But my absolute most anticipated release for the year is Ruth Ozeki's new book. I can't remember the name of it, but it's a new book by Ruth Ozeki, who's the author of A Tale for the Time Being, which is my favorite book of all time. I'm actually currently rereading this. I have less than 100 pages left, but I love this book and it means the absolute world to me. And to know that this author is finally coming out with a new book just makes me very happy. She has other books that I haven't read, but this one is new, which makes it more exciting. So I'm really looking forward to delving into Ruth Ozeki's new book. This is probably my #1 most anticipated release of the entire year. I'm very ready. And finally, the most beautiful book that you received for the year. I think this means in terms of the cover. I just showed you a ton of books with really great covers, you know, Where the Rhythm Takes You, An Emotion of Great Delight, The Anthropocene Reviewed. Really great covers. But a book you haven't seen yet, well, maybe you've seen it, but I haven't showed it on my channels yet, is this one. This is called The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea by Maggie Takada Hall. I picked this one up because Adri from Perpetual Pages was talking about it. The premise just sounded like it would help me with my Once Upon a Time Tabanka. Once Upon a Time is it just means so much to me as a show, and I really miss it, and it's exactly the kind of fantasy that I love, like light, whimsical, fairy tale fantasy as opposed to the more hardcore stuff, and I think this is kind of along those lines. It has like a pirate ship and whatnot, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the cover. We're a little bit more shallow with this one, and I love how the cover kind of expands to the back cover like this, and then we have these like floating islands, and like the ship is like passing it. Oh, it's so pretty. Hopefully the book matches the cover and lives up to my expectations. But that's it for my rendition of the Media Book Freakout Tag 2021. I will be doing this again next year. I will be doing this for as long as I'm on BookTube. So, you know, stay tuned for more of these. They're very exciting. In the comments down below, I'd love to know if you've read any of the books that I talked about today and if you have any thoughts on them. Otherwise, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely day, and until next time, inshallah, keep reading.